today to have with us for our department's webinar research seminar series, Dr. Marc Levine. Marc Levine has published a long list of reports on the state of Black Milwaukee in the past, which has become the gold standard for data on our city and the problems that we have faced continually in terms of inequalities between its white population and its African-American population. Now, Marc produced a report this past summer, which attracted a good bit of attention, as his reports always do, and it received significant media coverage, including in outlets as rich and diverse as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, CNN, etc. And it continues to generate both attention and to deliver insights into what is happening in Milwaukee with our African American population. Now, Dr. Levine is a colleague of ours here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He is the Professor Emeritus of History, and he also is the founding director of the Center for Economic Development, of which he still maintains, of course, a relationship with and is active with, even though he is formally retired. Among the many activities of note in his past are his work in government policy, where he served on the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, along with a friend of mine, James Galbraith, many decades ago. And so we are just absolutely delighted to have him with us here today, and we are going to be treated to a presentation of his research on the state of Black Milwaukee. And we're going to follow this with what I hope will be a rich and robust discussion on possible ways of addressing these inequalities that he is going to be enumerating and highlighting. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Marc Levine. Marc, please.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for having me this, I think, very interesting webinar. I'm really looking forward to discussing the findings of this paper and hearing some insights from folks in the department and hopefully many others who are watching this. What I want to do is give you just a very kind of general overview of what the study tried to do, and then hone in on a few of the areas that were analyzed, since this was a kind of a broad gauge study to look at trends in Black Milwaukee and in African American communities across the country in the largest metropolitan areas, across a whole range of variables. So, you know, there are 50 variables that we look at, or that I looked at in this study, and obviously we're not going to be able to discuss all of those, or I'm not going to present on all those, but I do want to focus on what I think are some of the more arresting findings. The study basically has sort of two components, a kind of comparative or cross-sectional one, and a historical or longitudinal one. The comparative one is to look at, across a series of these key indicators, where Black Milwaukee stands compared to African American communities in the nation's 50 largest metropolitan areas. I don't think we've had a clear sense in this community, nor have other communities had a clear sense of precisely where they stand if we benchmark you know, the well-being of the African American community. I mean, clearly in the research that I've done over the years, other folks have done, you know, we've documented some of the difficult conditions in Black Milwaukee, and there's been a sense in the popular media, the worst place for African Americans. Well, what this study does is kind of document it in a more rigorous way by comparing across the country, and I'll run through that in just a little bit. The other part, though, is historical, particularly in this summer of racial reckoning that has just passed and is continuing now into the fall. Lots of, again, media treatment of the topic dealt with how have things changed, if at all, over the last 40 or 50 years for African Americans. Have there been improvements in various areas? Is racial inequality beginning to narrow? Are racial gaps, racial disparities as yawningly wide as they were in the 60s and 70s? And so I think it's useful for us in Milwaukee, as well as in metro areas across the country, to have that historical perspective as well. Because it turns out in some metropolitan areas, actually, there has been rather substantial progress. It's not a uniform national situation, but as we'll see in Milwaukee, that progress has been very little, only in small selected areas and in small bites. So the study is both comparative and historical, and I think you'll get a pretty good sense of both where Milwaukee stands as well as what the situation is in African-American communities across the country if you look at it. One final preliminary point on this, which I think should be fairly obvious, but the data obviously is, there's a lag in the data that is available for doing subnational level studies in the United States. We rely mainly on the American Community Survey and a few other sources. That data basically runs through 2018. A little thing has happened recently called the COVID economic collapse. And so as distressing as so many of the numbers are in the study, we have to keep in mind that they're demonstrably worse. So they have become demonstrably worse since March 2020. I'll just take one example. The employment rate for African-American males in the prime working age years, 25 to 54, in Milwaukee is about 67%. As I'll point out, that's very, very low. It's 67% in the data that I present. My estimate is, we don't have hard numbers on this, but we have some inklings. My estimate is it's probably fallen just in the last 6 months to about 59%. So that'll give you just some sense of the extent to which the COVID crisis has affected variables. So as bad as variables look here, unfortunately, we're facing a much more difficult situation. First slide, please. Okay, and let's go to the second one. Next slide. Great. So in a nutshell, this is the sort of the quick overview of, and not all of the 50 variables that we looked at in this, but an overview of some of the key findings with regard to just a benchmarking issue. Where does Black Milwaukee stand on key indicators of community well-being among the nation's 50 largest metro areas? I think, Rachel, we need to go back one. Great, perfect. So as you go down here, and I'll just read down them and make a few comments. We remain the most segregated metropolitan area in the country by the standard measures that we use for segregation. And I'll talk just a little bit about that and about why that's the case, because I think that's a really crucial variable in explaining kind of the rest of the other findings. We have the highest Black poverty rate in the country. We have the lowest Black median household income. And one thing I did in this study that I don't think has been done in any other study of this nature is to actually make some adjustments for cost of living differences between metropolitan areas. Typically, we get sort of, the median household income is reported as X in one city, it's reported as Y in another. But I've made some adjustments, and I'll explain how I did that to try to take into account, for example, that Milwaukee has a slightly lower cost of living than other metro areas. But unfortunately, that lower cost of living still doesn't save us from having the lowest median household income for Blacks. We have the greatest gap in Black-white median household income, the third lowest median earnings for Black workers, the greatest gap in white male earnings, Black-white male earnings, third lowest employment rate for prime working age Black males, second widest Black-white gap in prime age employment rates, the second lowest Black home ownership rate, the lowest Black share of private sector management jobs, third highest Black prison incarceration rate, fourth worst Black infant mortality rate, the second worst Black rate of low birth weight babies, and the fourth lowest rate of upward economic mobility for poor Black youth. And I'm going to lean on that one a little bit in just a bit, because I think that's one of the key findings of this study that has ramifications for the future and certainly important policy implications. So next slide, Rachel. And if you add all of these up, what you get is quite an extraordinary situation of, on the indicators, of the 50 indicators that I looked at, Milwaukee ranked last or next to last on 20 of them. Black Milwaukee ranked in the bottom 5 of metro areas on over 80% of them, 41 of the measures, and Black Milwaukee ranked in the bottom 10 metro areas on 46 of the indicators. Basically only 4 indicators were we not in the bottom 10, and people have questions about that, I can explain that in a little bit. This is an extraordinary finding, I think. There are lots of metropolitan areas that are experiencing deep, pervasive, and entrenched racial inequality that is almost as bad as Milwaukee's. When you look at Pittsburgh, you look at Detroit, you look at Cleveland, Chicago to a certain extent, all rank poorly on most of these indicators, but not as consistently poorly across the board. And so the sort of self-interrogation that sort of comes up is like, why is that the case? Why is Milwaukee uniformly across the board on indicator after indicator in the bottom 1 or 2 or in the bottom 5 in the country? What is it about Milwaukee? And I think that's something that, you know, we're beginning to get some handle on. I think this study gives a little bit of kind of insight on that, but there's a lot of work to be done on this. I mean, what is so special in this regard about Milwaukee? Next slide. All right, so the first area I want to start off with, because I think it's really revealing, is the persistence of segregation in Milwaukee. The main way, and I'm not going to go into the deep weeds on this, the main way we tend to measure segregation, and it's certainly an imperfect way, but it's probably the best one we've got at this point, is calculating the index of dissimilarity, and called sometimes the segregation rate. And for those who haven't worked with it, basically anything above 80 is considered hyper-segregation, 60 to 80 is considered highly segregated, 40 to 60 on the segregation, on the dissimilarity index is modest segregation, and below 40 is relatively low segregation. There are only a couple of metro areas in the US that have segregation rates below 40. Most fall into the 40 to 60 range, but a big chunk fall into the 60 and above. One of the key findings here is the degree to which that rate has essentially not declined in Milwaukee over the past 40 years. It's declined a little bit from 84 to 79.4, basically a few points. But it's declined more in most metropolitan areas across the country. Now, we're a far cry from, and I would not repeat the conclusion of Ed Glazer and Jacob Vigdor, who wrote, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, that we've reached the end of the segregated century, that black-white segregation is a remnant of the 20th century. I mean, that's clearly an exaggeration. High levels of segregation persist. But as you can see, the top line on this graph shows Milwaukee, the average of the 50 largest metro areas has declined, I'd say modestly, from being close to hypersegregation at 70 to 59 in the most recent data. Next slide. So this slide shows basically on a few metro areas that were hyper-segregated for the most part through in 1980, where they are today. And I think this just underscores that larger point that I wanted to make, that Milwaukee stands out really as one of the few metro areas that has experienced the most minuscule of declines in segregation. I mean, you look at some places, and like Dallas, for example, in Kansas City, where the decline has been reasonably strong. But even places like Detroit and Atlanta and a little bit in Chicago, you can also see that there's been a decline. So I think one of the key factors to understand here as we look through the other variables is that we are a persistently segregated metro area, and that our segregation pattern in some ways simply resembles the cliched pattern of the 1960s or the 1970s, a white collar surrounding an increasingly Black and increasingly Latino central city. Next slide. So before I get to this slide, just one final point on the segregation issue. The key variable doesn't explain, but it connects to why we have such a high segregation rate, is the fact that we have the lowest rate of Black suburbanization in Milwaukee of any metro area in the country. Milwaukee, only 11% of the region's African-American population lives in the suburbs. In places like, again, fairly segregated places, and places that certainly are experiencing deep-seated racial inequality, like Cleveland and Detroit and Baltimore, almost half of the region's African-American population now lives in the suburbs. And I think that has profound implications because we know that the lion's share, in some cases, all of the net job growth in metro areas has occurred in these suburban areas. And so you have sort of the classic spatial mismatch operating in Milwaukee, where it's been attenuated somewhat in other metropolitan areas. And I think that helps explain some of the poor performance for Milwaukee, for Black Milwaukee on some of these other variables. All right, this slide in front of you deals with, I think, what is a, the sort of the, if segregation is sort of the underpinning of all this, the next key issue is that Black Milwaukee is an incredibly poor African-American community, the poorest in the country, I would argue, and that's not an exaggeration. What this chart shows is just the comparative listing of the 50 metro areas in terms of Black median annual household income in 2018, again, adjusted for regional cost of living differences. The reason I think that's important is that, and I've not done this in the past, is that it's a little misleading. I mean, if in fact we say, Black household income in San Francisco is $45,000 a year and it's $30,000 a year in Milwaukee, and you say, oh God, Milwaukee's much lower. But in fact, $45,000 in San Francisco or in Boston or in Los Angeles is not equal to $45,000 in Milwaukee. So you have to control for, I think, to get a realistic ranking here for the cost of living differences, particularly for lower cost of living places like Milwaukee. But the sad fact is that even doing that, and this is the cost of living adjusted income, so it's a little bit higher than the actual median household income, Milwaukee ranks by a hair behind Buffalo as having the lowest Black household income in the country. So it's a very, very poor community. Next slide. This shows the trend line since 1980. And again, the story is obviously what you would expect, that there's been a decline of substantial proportions in Milwaukee. Now, this is not the cost of living adjusted income. This is just the actual income, household income, Black household income in Milwaukee. It's declined about 30% since 1980. The biggest decline in any particular period occurred between 1980 and 1990, and that correlates with the demise of Milwaukee's industrial economy, the Great Recession of 1982 and 83, which just took the legs out from a relatively prosperous, that may be a little strong term prosperous, but certainly a stable, with lots of family supporting production jobs for African Americans in Milwaukee, and the wrenching of those out of the community has pulled a hole in the economic fabric that simply has not been replaced. But I think one thing to also note, between 2010 and 2018, again, this is all adjusted for inflation, median household income for African Americans in Milwaukee has continued to decline. Even in the recovery from the recession of 2010, it's gone down another 7 or 8% or so. And again, this is before the COVID recession. So we're talking about a community that has simply struggled mightily in the last 40 years, victimized by segregation, victimized disproportionately by deindustrialization and disinvestment from inner city communities. Next slide. And this is reflected in classic racial inequality in Milwaukee, the growing Black-white income gap in Milwaukee. And I've compared Milwaukee to the US. Note that in 1979, Black income in Milwaukee was about 58% of white income. It has fallen today, and again, the biggest decline was in those 1980s that I've already referenced, but it's nonetheless fallen today to only 42% of white income. And that is, by a large measure, the worst racial income disparity in the country. And note how different that is from what's been going on nationally. I mean, it isn't as if Black income in the country has gained substantially in terms of equity with regard to white income. But whereas in 1979, the gap was actually slightly less in Milwaukee, now it's yawningly much larger. White income, Black income is about 61% of white income nationally. It's 42% in Milwaukee. Next slide. So unsurprisingly, this helps explain why we have the highest Black poverty rate in the country. And I won't dwell on this, it's sort of an obvious chart. Poverty rate peaked actually in the end of those terrible 1980s. Again, it's a decade we really need to talk a lot about, because a lot of the bad things that got entrenched in Milwaukee's racial inequality took place during that decade. But by the end of the 1980s, Black poverty in Milwaukee had risen to an extraordinary 41%. It's come down a bit since then, went up a little bit during the recession, and it's come down to 33%. My guess is, again, just back of the envelope numbers from some national studies, that was probably up close to around 40%. Again, it hadn't probably gone up initially because of the initial impact of the CARES Act, but since those funds have been now terminated, most studies out of Columbia, which is studying poverty across the country, suggest that the Black poverty rate has risen substantially. Next slide. So one of the elements of this, and I want to dwell on this for just a bit, is that with low income and with segregation and with increasing poverty, Milwaukee is in a kind of almost a unique place of having this really serious concentrated poverty issue in the African American community. Sociologists define concentrated poverty neighborhoods as neighborhoods in which 40% or more of the population is poor. So you can be living in a concentrated poverty neighborhood. Your income may not make you poor, but you're living, in a poor neighborhood. And what's extraordinary in Milwaukee is that a very high percentage, 26% of all Black households in Milwaukee, live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, whether or not they are poor themselves. What I've done is broken this down by income class, because I think it's extraordinarily revealing about the challenges facing Black Milwaukee. If you look at the chart, you can see that for the poorest of households, the poorest of Black households, those making under $10,000 a year, almost 39% live in these concentrated poverty neighborhoods. And that's not surprising, is it? I mean, you would expect, obviously, if you're poor, you're living in a highly poor neighborhood, especially in a segregated city like Milwaukee, where African Americans are clustered into some of these poor neighborhoods. And as you go up in income, you would expect that percentage to go down, and in fact it does. But what's quite striking is that even when you get to relatively affluent Black households in Milwaukee, those making over $100,000 a year, about 1 in 7, 1 in 7.5, live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, which is the highest rate in the country. There are a few metro areas in which that rate is fairly close to the $100,000 households. Buffalo, I think, is one. Detroit is one. But Milwaukee stands out as high. And what really stands out, and that's why I have it in red on this chart, is that if you look at the Black over 100,000 households, and you look at the white under 10,000 households, you see that the rate of Black affluent households living in concentrated poverty neighborhoods is almost twice the rate of the poorest white households. You could argue in some ways, I'm borrowing a little bit from Patrick Sharkey's work and Stuck in Place here when he says $100,000 for an African-American household buys the quality of neighborhood for about a $30,000 a year household for whites. You could argue using this data that $100,000 doesn't even buy the quality of neighborhood for African-Americans that $10,000 does for whites in Milwaukee. I mean, there's that big of a gap. Next slide. This is how concentrated poverty has grown, by the way, in Milwaukee since the 1970s. You can see, obviously, the neighborhoods corresponding to, for the most part, again, the huge growth in the 1980s, the north side and increasingly the northwest side. And increasingly since 2000 and 2010, the south side as well. And I'm not going to talk about it today since I'm talking about the state of Black Milwaukee, but there's been quite a surge in concentrated poverty in Milwaukee's Latino community as well. And I've analyzed that in other papers. Next slide. So, to summarize this, and I think, again, these findings, I keep using the word extraordinary, but they just strike me as amazing. In Milwaukee, a Black household with annual income over $100,000 a year is 22 times more likely than a similarly affluent white household to live in a concentrated poverty neighborhood. A Black household with income over $100,000 a year is almost twice as likely to live in a concentrated poverty neighborhood as a white household with annual income under $10,000. So that's, again, the big gap. A Milwaukee Black household with income over $100,000 is 11 times more likely than a similarly affluent Black household in Baltimore or Atlanta to live in a concentrated poverty neighborhood, and 33 times more likely than comparable households in Seattle or Raleigh to live in such a neighborhood. So you have $100,000 a year in Milwaukee, you have $100,000 a year in Seattle, and you're 33 times likelier to live in a concentrated poverty neighborhood in Milwaukee if you're African-American, even with income at $100,000 a year, which would seem to imply you'd have much greater ability to live where you want in the metro area. Next slide. So the two stunning consequences, I think, if we look at the concentrated poverty data combined with the poverty and the income data and linking it to segregation, is that affluent Black households in Milwaukee are significantly likelier to live in a concentrated poverty neighborhood than in anywhere in the country. And that not only is a $100,000 a year Black household in Milwaukee likelier to live in a concentrated poverty than a $10,000 household, it's likelier to do that over a $10,000 a year white household than any place in the country. There is no place in the country where the rate of living in concentrated poverty for a $10,000 a year white household is as high as the rate in Milwaukee for a $100,000 a year household. Okay, next slide. And I'll go through these slides very quickly. Rachel, I'll just go quickly. This just shows graphically what I just described to you in the table. This is where low-income Black households in Milwaukee. The area that's in green on the map are the concentrated poverty neighborhoods, the 40% plus neighborhoods. And you can see, obviously, about 40% of the Black households in Milwaukee live in the northern part of that concentrated poverty neighborhoods. Next. This is where white low-income households, again, much more dispersed. White poverty is very different than Black poverty. Black poverty is concentrated, tends to be persistent and pervasive. White poverty tends to be more decentralized in Milwaukee, deconcentrated. Even poor whites live in neighborhoods where they perhaps have access to better services, better schools, and the consequences of that we will see in a second for the future, for economic opportunity and for mobility, are profound. But you can see the difference, obviously, with low-income white non-Hispanic households. Next slide. These are where affluent Black households live. Again, almost all live in the city of Milwaukee. About 60% live in the city, and a big chunk, about 13%, live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, some on the north side, some on the more toward the northwest side. And finally, affluent white households. Next slide. You can see, to coin a phrase, they pretty much live anywhere they want. And very few, obviously 0.6% from the earlier slide, live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods. A bit of a concentration on the east side, North Shore, but obviously a huge number out in Waukesha County and obviously spread out across the metro area. Next slide. And just to show you the difference, I've pulled up a slide from a study I did of Baltimore. And you can see this is the, again, 100,000 plus households in Baltimore. And the little box in the middle is the city of Baltimore. And you can see, and you can't really see the concentrated poverty neighborhoods there. They're covered up, obviously, by the Black population. But you can see how many of the affluent Blacks live outside of the city of Baltimore, let alone in a concentrated poverty neighborhood. It's just a completely different experience. And again, this is a city. This is the city of Freddie Gray. This is a city of incredible, this is of The Wire. This is a city of amazing racial disparities, but it's a different kind, and the opportunity structure is different than it is in Milwaukee. Okay, next one. All right, so consequence of this, and I'm going to run through these pretty quickly so we have time for discussion and Q&A. The key consequence is a truncating of economic mobility. And back to the Patrick Sharkey point about being stuck in place. That economic opportunity for Black Milwaukee has essentially been truncated, I believe, by the persistence of concentrated poverty and all of the neighborhood conditions that flow from concentrated poverty, this extraordinarily high rate of concentrated poverty in Milwaukee. And what I've looked through is this wonderful data set that's been assembled by the Harvard University Opportunity Insights group, which involves just a huge data set of census and tax data to track people over a generation to see how their economic mobility has in fact occurred. Milwaukee has, as I pointed out earlier, among the lowest rates of Black intergenerational mobility. That is, if you were born in a poor Black family in the 1970s or early 80s, which is where their data comes from, you're likely in 2014, where the next batch of data is, to also be in a low income group, much likelier than whites and much likelier than Blacks across the country, for that matter. In Milwaukee, the gap is fairly considerable. What this chart shows is the early adult income. So these are people basically between the ages of 31 and 37 in 2014, who were born in Milwaukee in the late 70s and early 80s into low income households, households that were in the bottom quartile, bottom 25% of income in the national income distribution. You can see the rather large gap of $17,000 a year. That's about an 80% gap. So a Black household, a Black who grew up in a poor household in Milwaukee earns about 80% less than a white who grew up in a poor household, starting from the same economic situation, but I would argue living in different neighborhoods, so place matters, and living in concentrated poverty versus deconcentrated poverty seems to have made a huge difference here and distinguishes not only Black and white here, but Milwaukee's Blacks from Blacks across the country. Next slide. This, in fact, shows where we stand in terms of the economic mobility for Black youth born into poor households in metro areas across the country. And you can see that Milwaukee ranks fourth from the bottom. Only Cleveland, Tampa, and Cincinnati are worse. And the income levels are fairly clustered. I should point out, up even to the middle. So the difference between Milwaukee and, say, the 15th ranked metro area, Oklahoma City, is about 10 to 12%, but that is real income. But there is, about a 40 to 45% difference, again, for a poor Black born into a poor family in Milwaukee versus a poor family in Boston, Washington, D.C., or New York or Providence. The chances of mobility in those places are much greater. Again, I would argue segregation and concentrated poverty have a great deal to do with that. But as we look at the future and we look at, obviously, things we need to do to improve economic opportunity, these data, I think, are quite eye-opening. Okay, next slide. Again, very quickly, I don't want to belabor some of these. This is where we stand in terms of employment. I've written about this quite a bit over the last 30 years, really, about Milwaukee and its employment crisis for Black males. You can see quite clearly on this chart how that crisis has emerged over the last 50 years, that from an employment rate for prime age males of 85% in Milwaukee, that dropped as low as 59% by 2010. That was, in 2010, the lowest rate in the country. The white-Black gap of almost 30 percentage points, the largest in the country. What's interesting here a little bit is that there was a bit of a rebound between 2010 and 2018. And I'm actually just starting to analyze this for a different paper. But there clearly was some progress on this for the first time in a generation. But my estimate is that it's been obliterated by the COVID collapse. So we'll have to see what happens kind of after that. But I think the key point here, again, is a long-standing decline in the employment of prime working age Black males in Milwaukee. A decline as well for white males. And then this has been an argument that's been made with regard to the changing structure of the economy, but not nearly as great, and obviously still up near 90%, which is not very far from where it was in 1970. Okay, next slide. These are women. And again, the racial disparity is very clear. I think what's interesting is how the white rate jumped the Black rate in the 1970s. And that was as a consequence, obviously, of the surge of white women entering the labor force, Milwaukee actually has the second highest employment rate for prime age white women in the country. So white women have entered the Milwaukee labor force in force and have remained in it in force. For Black women, the rate has remained relatively constant, frankly, from even the 1970s, went up after 2000, probably a consequence a bit of welfare reform, and has kind of remained there, but I suspect has come down in the COVID situation. Next slide. This one I just want to talk about a bit because it's important, and I know I'm running a little bit late, so I'm going to rush through the rest of this. But I think it's important because we need to understand how race continues to matter in the Milwaukee labor market. And it's beyond simply comparing the white and the Black employment rates and seeing that that gap persists. Because even if we control for education, and we say, okay, let's compare people of similar education levels, where one would expect a skills-based or education or credentials-based argument would not apply, we see huge gaps in white, Black employment rates. Take, for example, whites and Blacks without a high school diploma. A high school dropout being obviously the curse in the current labor market. You can see that if you look at the extreme left bar chart, that the white rate is employment rate is 2.5 times what it is for the Black high school dropout. At each educational level, if we're controlling for education, the white rate is higher. And in fact, some of it's quite extraordinary. A white without a high school diploma has actually a higher employment rate in Milwaukee than a Black with a high school degree. So clearly education matters. If you look at the Black employment rates, they go up by education level. So this doesn't say education doesn't matter, but what it does say is race matters. Race continues to matter, and it's linked to a lot of factors like where the jobs are being created and segregation and spatial mismatch and persistent discrimination. But this gap is important, and this data I think is important. And Milwaukee's employment rate for example, for Black high school dropouts is not only so much lower than the white rate, but it's lower than for high school dropouts, Black high school dropouts across the country. Next slide. This puts it in terms of income. And I unfortunately can't get the racial income, or I haven't gotten it yet, for the entire metro area. But what I do have is sort of an arresting comparison by education level for Blacks living in 53206, since 53206 is 97% African-American, we can assume everyone in this pool is African-American, and Waukesha County, which is obviously 95% white. So we know that obviously the vast majority of the people in this data are white. And I think the killer number that I saw, which I've highlighted in red, is that a high school dropout in Waukesha County probably has access to the remaining industrial jobs that exist in places like New Berlin and Heartland and elsewhere. Actually, it's statistically insignificant, but nonetheless has a slightly higher median annual earnings than an African-American with a bachelor's degree living in 53206. Which shows that both race continues to matter and probably living in 53206, isolated from where jobs are growing and isolated in some ways by transportation as well, are certainly critical there. Great, perfect. Next slide. Just the incarceration issue. We obviously know about Milwaukee's exceedingly high incarceration rate. The data is actually fairly hard to come by. What this paper does is actually present, I think for the first time, some systematic data on this. It's a little better than some of the data that's been floating around in Milwaukee, but it shows clearly that between 1990 and 2000, there was a surge in Black incarceration in Milwaukee County. The Black incarceration rate by 2000, when it peaked, was about 13 times higher than the white rate. It's come down a bit since then, but it's still obviously high. And the data that I presented earlier, it's the third highest in the country if we simply use this data. Next slide. This is data from the Harvard project, again, the Opportunity Insights, simply trying to track of the people who were born into low-income neighborhoods in the late 1970s and 80s, what percentage were incarcerated in 2010. And this one, Milwaukee is at the top. 16% of Milwaukee's poor Black youth who grew up in poor neighborhoods between 1978 and 1983 were incarcerated in 2010. Next slide. All right, so let me just sort of conclude by the way I concluded the paper with a quote from Dr. King, in which he said, "There's no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community," talking about Birmingham in 1963. "Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here." And I make sort of I wouldn't call it a snarky remark, but I think it's an important one to say that Dr. King would be in Milwaukee today, given the level of inequality that I've documented here, as indeed he was in Milwaukee in the mid-1960s, as well as our civil rights struggle was emerging. Next slide. And I have a series of slides in here, as well as, and these are drawn from the paper, but they show that if Birmingham was the exemplar of a racial regime, of a Jim Crow de jure regime that Dr. King was breaking down in the 1960s, Milwaukee to me represents the 21st century version of a caste-like apartheid system that doesn't rely as obviously on the repression of the state, although there are other elements that clearly do, but it's more baked into the institutional arrangements and the public policies and the culture and societal norms here that have led to as deep a racial inequality as existed in Birmingham in the 1960s. And ironically, as you look at this chart and the ones that will follow, Birmingham is much improved from the 60s. This is household income, 37,000 for a Black household in Birmingham, 29 in Milwaukee. That's completely different, obviously, than 1969. Next slide. Household income, the Black-white racial gap is much, much higher here. Birmingham's is about the national average, 59%. In Milwaukee, it's only 42%. And the final slide, poverty rates, the Black poverty rate in Milwaukee, which is of course the worst in the country, 33.4, it's come down steadily in Birmingham. It's still 1 in 4, so it's still way too high. But again, there's been a complete flipping here. And so I think as we think of the historical valence of Birmingham and the struggle for Birmingham and the way in which that figured in the fight for equality, it's striking to me to have a comparison of Milwaukee to that, to see where Milwaukee stands. So why don't I close there and leave it for questions, discussion, and comment, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great, Mark. Thank you very much for a very detailed presentation that really helps to bring greater focus to the problems that we all know that exist in Milwaukee. We have a couple of questions that we'll be addressing here momentarily. I just do want to say that later in the academic year with our department seminar series at the African Diaspora Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, we're going to be having Sheila Cochran, who used to work in Milwaukee manufacturing as an assembly line worker, and Mike Rosen talking about deindustrialization in Milwaukee, which I think is going to be a great follow-up presentation to yours. That will be in March. So we look forward to seeing what they have to say. But we have a couple of questions here on the question board. And the first is from Pam Fent, who asks, do you think there are items in the Biden Build Back Better plan that could help address these intransigent disparities?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, from what I've seen of it, and of course, the devil will be in the details, what can get passed and what can be politically feasible. But there are a whole series of policies proposed that I think would lead to substantial reinvestment in distressed inner city areas, dollars for early childhood education, dollars for job training, dollars for community development, and I think those make a difference. I can't recall whether, I'm going to guess that they probably did put into the plan a reinstating of and I now always forget what it stands for, Affirmative Furthering of Fair Housing, the AFFH policies, designed obviously to break down some of the walls of segregation. And I think those would certainly be important. My guess is they will also look at some of the pilot projects that are going on in so-called move to opportunity programs to, again, deconcentrate poverty. But I think as I read the policy, it's both it's a felicitous mix of direct investment. I mean, I wouldn't call it a Marshall Plan for cities necessarily, but it seems to me to point in that direction. And so certainly more than anything that's been out there recently, I think there's some real promise in those policies.
Great, fantastic. And my colleague, my department colleague, Dr. Gladys Mitchell-Walthor, asks, Professor Levine, have you conducted interviews with affluent Blacks in Milwaukee to find out if Milwaukee native-born Blacks choose to live in high poverty neighborhoods, whereas non-native Blacks choose to live in the suburbs? As an African-American who is not born in Milwaukee, it's always amazing to me how committed native Blacks, Milwaukee Blacks, regardless of income, such as affluent Blacks, are to living in high poverty neighborhoods. I haven't witnessed this in other parts of the country.
Yes, that's a great question. Thanks for it. Obviously, your observation of it not taking place elsewhere in the country to any great extent conforms to the data that obviously I presented on this. I mean, Milwaukee kind of stands out as having this high rate of affluent households living in high poverty neighborhoods. I haven't, and I'll get to the interview question in just a second, I haven't broken down the data by, which I think would be interesting, but I'm guessing since the N for this is small, that we may not be able to get reliable data even through IPUMs or something on the native to Milwaukee versus African-Americans who have moved to Milwaukee in terms of living in concentrated poverty neighborhoods or not. So I can't answer that in a data way. And I don't want to embarrass myself by people who have both skills and academic expertise and serious ethnography to say that I've conducted anything approaching interviews that would have any kind of scientific validity on this. But both in my travels around town, in my participation on panels, in presenting this research, I have discussions with a non-trivial number of African Americans who fall into that income category, household income category, and my sense is that a full ethnographic study would reveal a mix of these variables. But the fact that it's not clear that the factor explaining this rather large number, 13% of Black affluent living in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, is explainable just by a choice to live in that neighborhood, as opposed to moving to White Folks Bay isn't what's going to be comfortable for me. It's likelier I'm going to get hassled, or my kid's going to get hassled, or let alone moving out to the WOW counties, where a very small percentage of the African American affluent live. But what continues to confound me a little bit is that I understand a bit of let's call it the choice argument. What I don't understand is the choice argument linked to living in a concentrated poverty neighborhood. That is to say, there are other neighborhoods. Every neighborhood, every predominantly Black block, or every predominantly Black section of a census tract is not a concentrated poverty area. And in fairness, the majority, obviously, of affluent African Americans don't live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods. I mean, 87% don't. It's this 13%. And so it's possible that 13% is a high, there's a heightened sense of community commitment, a heightened sense of, I won't name names, but I do know several people, quite active in improving the community who fall into that income category and live in that neighborhood for reasons of commitment. So I guess, in my fumbling response here, it's a very complicated issue. But I do think that in the persistent segregation of Milwaukee and the sort of the racial regime that I guess I've been describing plays a role in this in terms of circumscribing either opportunity or choice of various neighborhoods. Now, another thing, and this is just a technical point, the data that I have breaks down by census tract. It says, okay, concentrated poverty neighborhoods by census tract. It is possible that my data, I hate to say this, but it might be a little misleading in that some of the African Americans who are showing up living in concentrated poverty census tracts may in fact be living in a corner of the tract, which is not technically sort of in the entire the poorest areas of that tract, but still reasonably close. So it's a complicated issue, but I do think, as Gladys points out, the disparity between here and metro areas across the country is quite striking.
Just operating on the level of a hunch, I'm just wondering what your assessment is of, or your sense of, the argument that the relatively recent arrival in terms of African Americans as a percentage of the Milwaukee population in the upper Midwest, compared to other upper Midwest cities, might also be a factor as well. In other words, the migration kind of happens a little bit later.
Right.
And so the community isn't as anchored as it is in some other upper Midwest cities. I guess other analogs to Milwaukee might be Minneapolis, where that migration took place later.
And the affluent Black population in Minneapolis is fairly dispersed, right?
Right.
Many live in the suburbs.
Yeah.
In fact, Minneapolis is segregation. It's ironic given the horrors of Minneapolis over the summer, but Minneapolis's overall segregation level is much lower than Milwaukee's, and in fact has declined a fair amount over the past 20 years, although there's been some resegregation recently. But I do think the late arrival thesis does have a bit of a power in explaining the broad range of inequalities that on which there's been almost no progress here. And again, this is kind of well established in the literature generally. Arriving in the North, just as deindustrialization was beginning to take hold. I know you have Mike Rosen coming in to talk about that, but as those jobs decline, you see that vertiginous drop in the Black employment rate in Milwaukee, and just the bottom really dropping out. I do think arriving at a point where the city's prosperity was obviously under siege, and in which the jobs that were accessible to modestly skilled workers were drying up, played a very important role in creating this. Right. We see this with great power, obviously, in the 1980s with the crash of 1982. Yeah,
whereas the Twin Cities, it seems the difference was, while in both cases we have this late arrival, the economic situation in the Twin Cities was better than in Milwaukee. So they didn't suffer, of course, as much as we did with the industrialization.
Right. Although, but there are still some indicators, though. For example, Milwaukee has Black home ownership rate of 27%, which is the second lowest in the country. The lowest is Minneapolis. Now there again may be peculiarities on that, but I don't think so, because white home ownership is actually very high in Minneapolis, so the gap is the biggest country. So there are all sorts of these kind of anomalies buried into the data, and sort of explaining different cities. But I do think that one of the interesting things ultimately to try to figure out is, if you sort of aggregate through all of these data, that, there are a set of metro areas in which the indicators are not, in no metro area are they as uniformly good as they are uniformly bad in Milwaukee.
Mhm.
But there are a few, that sort of bubble up to the top. Ironically, Boston. And again, there are complexities there, but given Boston's, racist history and racist president in some ways, I think that's an interesting finding that on a lot of these variables, Boston's relatively high. Raleigh, Charlotte, some of the sort of the new Sunbelt cities, Denver, places like that. And so I think, the next stage of sort of trying to understand some of these trends is to really look at some of those places and see what, and I think, the common thread is even Boston has seen segregation decline. The segregation levels are much less. And so their regional economies are maybe a little bit better knitted together. There isn't this bifurcation, this polarization that exists here. I think
well, it seems that, with some exceptions, as you've already pointed out, that, overall affluence helps. And of course, this has been a deficit for us here in Milwaukee in recent decades, which I guess brings me to a topic that I wanted to get your input on. And, just thinking most basically about what can be done to change the situation in Milwaukee, but not only in Milwaukee and in other cities as well. But it seems as though to a certain extent, we've seen some of these problems before in the 1930s, right? So in the 1930s, we had a wealth to income gap in terms of a percentage of GDP of both that looks more like today's than it did from the New Deal through to the 1970s.
Right.
So we've seen a shift towards less income as a percentage of the economy, and more toward a wealth. And when we saw this same trend in the 1920s, one of the ways that this was at least partially resolved was through taking low skill industrial jobs. They were not all high skill. Most of them were really dull, low skill jobs, and we just made them high wage jobs.
Exactly. Right.
And
we
so,
did that through unions. We
exactly.
didn't mandate it. We did it through unions and to some extent a higher minimum wage. Yeah,
right.
I think
so it seems like those two things are just absolutely essential. If
well, one of the things, right, from Pam's question earlier about Build Back Better, that I know is in the plan. One is obviously to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and some very good recent research shows that raising the minimum wage in the 1960s had disproportionate advantages for African American workers in closing, income gaps or earnings gaps with white workers, and because a disproportionate number, 85% of African American workers in Milwaukee earn under $40,000 a year, right? So 30,000 would get you under the $15 an hour, but I'm not exactly sure, what the percentage is there. But my basic point is, Black Milwaukee is disproportionately represented in low wage occupations. So if you raise the floor, you will raise obviously those wages, and that of course then ripples through in terms of the income disparities. And of course we know there's a vast literature on the importance of unions in raising incomes. And so those sort of non-racial policies, they are universalistic, but I guess maybe they're somewhat targeted within universalism, would actually have a disproportionately positive effect, not only for Black Milwaukee, but for African Americans across the country.
Right, and of course, that's what we saw in places such as Kenosha, Wisconsin, which of course has seen this recent turbulence. That if you take a look at the Motors, as it was called, American Motors, and later Chrysler, these union pay structures had non-discriminatory effects. There was less nonsense going on in terms of who made what amount of money. Right. If you didn't have a boss that was just arbitrarily setting wage rates based on whatever it is that they were setting them on. If you have a union scale, that's going to disproportionately benefit African American labor and start moving people up the income ladder generally, which is again in the case of Kenosha, where when Chrysler finally closed down, I think something like a full 30% of its workforce was African American. They were making high wages, and that contributed mightily to what
I
was.
think that might be a little high, but yeah, it's certainly in the 20 to 25% range.
Yeah, it was quite high. Maybe
But nonetheless, right, and
Yeah.
that's true across the board. I mean, you look at
Right.
A.M. Smith in Milwaukee, Master Lock. I mean, you look at a number of employers. But I think this has been, in the overall context of our political economy and the attack on unions of really below the last 40 years, 45 years, but accelerating certainly in the 2010s in this state. We need to understand that that's not only important in terms of overall economic inequality, the whole Thomas Piketty control of the 1%, and this and that, but is very important in terms of issues of racial inequality. And
Right.
I would certainly endorse focusing on that.
And certainly, even though Joe Biden has rejected the Green New Deal, I mean, he has adopted certain aspects of it, and it would seem that the idea of creating more compact green cities would also disproportionately help African American labor by again bringing income into these areas that would help to reduce some of these inequalities. So these, it seems like there are several things that could actually be done politically, that it's not, a matter of unavailability of solutions. It's just a matter of political will.
Yeah, no, I think there are solutions. I think it's a matter of political mobilization, but hopefully, 2021 will be better.
Right. Well, I certainly hope so. Well, Marc, we've reached the end of our hour, and so I'm going to just conclude by thanking you. Really, really a great presentation, really an important one for policy purposes, also for political reasons as well. I hope we continue to see such, a quality output from you going forward in the future. So we have enjoyed your really, really superb work for a long time, and I hope we will for some time yet. I want to have our participants know that they are certainly our audience members willing to join us again at the Department of African Diaspora Studies Department seminar series, and we have a number of concurrent webinar series as well. Check our department webpage for some of those events. I mentioned Sheila Cochran and Mike Rosen, who are going to be coming. If his health permits, Noam Chomsky is going to join us on February 5th to discuss his lifetime of experience in protest movements, over some 8 decades now, which is an impressive record. And just also to put out there that it is the application season for those who are interested in our master's program and our PhD program. If anyone is interested, please check our webpage for information about that. So thank you to all who joined us. And again, especially to you, Marc.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thank everyone.
Great. Let's stay in touch. Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.